The photograph arrived in a plain envelope, creased at the corners from its long journey across the Atlantic. Eleanor Hayes held it with trembling fingers, studying the stern face of Marcus Thornton, the man who would become her husband in 3 weeks' time. Philadelphia, 1876. The words were printed beneath his image in careful script, along with a promise of prosperity and respectability. At 23, Eleanor had few choices left. Her parents were dead, her brother's family could barely feed themselves, and the textile mill where she worked had just announced another round of wage cuts. Marriage to a stranger in America seemed less frightening than slow starvation in Manchester. The voyage across the ocean took 6 terrible weeks. Eleanor spent most of it below deck, sick and scared, clutching her small trunk of belongings. Inside were 3 dresses, her mother's Bible, a silver locket, and the letters Marcus had sent. He wrote about his mercantile business, his fine house on Chestnut Street, and the cultured society of Philadelphia. He mentioned nothing about kindness or affection, but Eleanor told herself that such things might grow with time. She had seen enough loveless marriages survive on less. Philadelphia's harbor overwhelmed her senses when the ship finally docked. The noise, the crowds, the harsh American accents shouting in languages she couldn't identify. Eleanor stood on the gangplank in her best dress, the green wool one she'd saved for this moment, scanning the crowd for Marcus Thornton's face. When he appeared, she felt her stomach drop. The photograph had been old, perhaps 10 years out of date. The man approaching was easily 50, with cold gray eyes and lips pressed into a disapproving line. Their wedding took place the next morning in a courthouse with 2 strangers as witnesses. Marcus signed the papers with swift efficiency, his hand never once seeking hers. Eleanor's signature wavered on the line, but she completed it. The deed was done. She was Mrs. Marcus Thornton now, for better or worse. As they rode through Philadelphia's streets toward his home, Marcus finally spoke beyond curt instructions. His voice was ice. He told her the rules of his household. She would speak when spoken to. She would maintain his home to exacting standards. She would produce no scandal. The word obey fell from his lips like a judge's sentence. The house on Chestnut Street was indeed fine, 3 stories of brick and marble that should have filled Eleanor with relief. Instead, dread settled into her bones as she crossed the threshold. Marcus showed her through the rooms with mechanical precision, pointing out the parlor where she would receive his business associates' wives, the dining room where she would serve his evening meal at precisely 6 o'clock, the kitchen where she would work alongside the housekeeper. Then he showed her the bedroom. His bedroom. Eleanor's protest died in her throat when she saw his expression darken. That first night taught Eleanor the true meaning of brutality. Marcus viewed her as property, purchased and paid for, with no more feelings than the furniture in his fine house. When she wept, he struck her across the face and told her to be silent. When she tried to resist, he reminded her that she had nowhere to go, no money, no friends in this vast foreign city. She was his wife under law and God, and she would submit. By morning, Eleanor's body was covered in bruises that her high-necked dress would hide from the world. The weeks that followed blurred together in a nightmare of fear and pain. Marcus maintained his respectable facade in public, greeting neighbors with cool courtesy and conducting his business with shrewd intelligence. Behind closed doors, he was a monster. He controlled every aspect of Eleanor's existence, from the food she ate to the moment she could step outside. He read her letters before she sent them, ensuring she wrote nothing that might hint at her situation. Eleanor learned quickly that survival meant silence, submission, and waiting for any chance at escape. 6 months into her marriage, Eleanor had perfected the art of invisibility. She moved through Marcus's house like a ghost, anticipating his needs before he voiced them, disappearing from rooms when his temper began to rise. The bruises had become so common that she could map them by memory, knowing which ones would fade and which would be replaced before they healed. The housekeeper, Mrs. Brennan, saw everything and said nothing, her eyes full of pity but her mouth sealed by the need to keep her position. In Philadelphia's proper society, what happened between a man and his wife was sacred and secret. Marcus's business took him to New York for a week in late autumn. Eleanor felt the tension leave her shoulders the moment his carriage disappeared down Chestnut Street. For 7 precious days, she could breathe. She could move without calculating whether her steps would anger him. She could eat her meals without her stomach churning with anxiety. Mrs. Brennan grew bold in Marcus's absence, bringing Eleanor extra portions and speaking to her with kindness. The housekeeper was perhaps 60, with grown children somewhere out west. She had worked for Marcus for 5 years and seen 2 wives before Eleanor. She never said what became of them, but her meaningful silences spoke volumes. On the 4th day of Marcus's absence, Mrs. Brennan brought Eleanor a cup of tea and sat down heavily at the kitchen table. What she said next changed everything. She told Eleanor about the railroad lines pushing west into territories where American law barely reached. She spoke of wagon trains heading to Oregon and California, carrying people who wanted to leave their old lives behind. She mentioned friends in the Quaker community who helped desperate women disappear, no questions asked. The words hung in the air like smoke signals. Eleanor's heart began to pound. Could she actually do it? Could she run? The planning consumed Eleanor's every waking thought during those final 3 days. She had no money of her own, but she discovered that Marcus kept a cash box in his study for household expenses. She had watched him open it dozens of times, memorizing the location of the key. The moral weight of stealing from her husband warred with the knowledge that he had stolen her entire life. She took what she needed and not a penny more, along with her mother's locket and the warmest clothes she owned. Mrs. Brennan provided a canvas bag and a piece of paper with an address in Germantown, where the Quakers ran a safe house. Marcus returned on a cold Tuesday morning, and Eleanor served him breakfast with hands that barely shook. She had become an expert at hiding her emotions, a skill that now served her desperate purpose. That afternoon, while Marcus conducted business in his study, Eleanor told Mrs. Brennan she was going to the market. Instead, she walked in the opposite direction, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Every street felt too long, every stranger's glance felt suspicious. She expected Marcus to appear at any moment, to drag her back to Chestnut Street by her hair. The Quaker house stood plain and quiet behind a white fence. A woman answered Eleanor's knock, her face lined with compassion and experience. She asked no questions, just ushered Eleanor inside and bolted the door. There were 3 other women there, all fleeing circumstances they couldn't name. They shared bread and soup in silence, united by their desperation. That night, Eleanor slept in a small room under a patchwork quilt, and for the first time in months, she didn't wake screaming. She knew Marcus would search for her. She knew he would be methodical and ruthless. But she also knew she would rather die free than live one more day as his prisoner. The Quakers moved Eleanor 3 times in 2 weeks, shuffling her between safe houses as Marcus's hired men searched the city. She heard later that he offered a substantial reward for information leading to his wife's return. He told people she was mentally unstable, that she needed medical care, that he was desperate with worry. Philadelphia society clucked their tongues in sympathy for the poor abandoned husband. Only the network of women who ran the Underground Railroad for battered wives knew the truth. They had seen men like Marcus before and would see them again. Finally, 3 weeks after her escape, Eleanor found herself at a train station with a ticket west and a new name. The Quakers had provided her with papers identifying her as Eleanor Whitmore, a widow traveling to join family in Nebraska Territory. The story was thin but plausible enough if she didn't encounter serious scrutiny. As the train pulled away from Philadelphia, Eleanor pressed her face to the window and watched the city disappear into the distance. She was leaving behind the only country she had ever known, heading into an uncertain future with nothing but the clothes on her back and $30 sewn into her hem. Terror and exhilaration warred in her chest. Whatever came next, it would be hers. Her choice. Her life. The train carried Eleanor west through an America she had only read about in books. Pennsylvania's rolling hills gave way to Ohio's flat farmlands, then Indiana's endless cornfields. At each stop, she feared someone would recognize her, that Marcus's reach would prove longer than she hoped. But no one gave the quiet woman in widow's black a second glance. She was invisible again, but this time by choice. Other passengers occasionally attempted conversation, but Eleanor's soft English accent and polite brevity discouraged further questions. She preferred silence anyway. Every mile between herself and Philadelphia felt like a small victory. Nebraska Territory in late November was a shock to her system. The cold cut through her clothes like knives, and the wind across the prairie never seemed to stop. The train deposited her in Omaha, a rough frontier town that made Philadelphia's docks look civilized. Men carried guns openly on the streets. The buildings were mostly wood, hastily constructed and already weathering poorly. Eleanor found a boarding house run by a German woman who asked no questions about her past. For 3 weeks, she worked in the kitchen to pay for her room, scrubbing pots and peeling vegetables until her hands were raw. She needed to decide on her next move, but the vastness of her options paralyzed her. The other boarders were an assortment of drifters, prospectors heading to the Black Hills, and railroad workers. One evening, a weathered woman named Sarah struck up a conversation with Eleanor over dinner. Sarah had been out west for 20 years, following her husband through gold rushes and bust towns. She spoke casually about hardships that would have destroyed Eleanor months earlier. When Eleanor mentioned she needed to move further from civilization, Sarah suggested Fort Robinson, an army outpost near the Wyoming border. The military presence meant relative safety, and the isolation meant fewer questions. It sounded perfect. Getting to Fort Robinson proved more complicated than Eleanor anticipated. The railroad only went so far, and the final leg required a wagon train or private arrangement. Eleanor used half her remaining money to secure a place with a family heading northwest. The Johnsons were homesteaders, decent people with 3 children and impossible optimism about farming on the Great Plains. They left Omaha on a bright December morning, the wagon loaded with supplies and hope. Eleanor helped Mrs. Johnson with the children, making herself useful to justify her presence. For 2 days, the journey proceeded smoothly despite the bitter cold. The storm hit on the 3rd day without warning. One moment the sky was clear, the next it had turned a sickly green-gray and the temperature plummeted. Mr. Johnson shouted something about finding shelter, but his words were torn away by wind that suddenly roared across the plain like a living thing. Snow began falling so thick that Eleanor couldn't see the front of the wagon. The horses panicked, rearing and pulling against their traces. Mrs. Johnson clutched her smallest child and screamed for the others. Eleanor grabbed the 6-year-old boy as the wagon lurched violently to one side. Everything happened at once. The wagon tipped, spilling its contents and passengers onto the frozen ground. Eleanor hit hard, knocking the wind from her lungs. When she managed to stand, the world was white chaos. She could hear the Johnsons shouting but couldn't see them. The cold was immediate and absolute, burning her exposed skin and stealing her breath. She called out, stumbling in what she hoped was the right direction, but the wind swallowed her voice. Her feet went numb first, then her hands. Snow caked her eyelashes and blinded her. She fell twice, each time finding it harder to rise. Eleanor had survived crossing an ocean and escaping a brutal husband only to die freezing on an empty prairie. The irony would have made her laugh if she could feel her face. She fell a 3rd time and couldn't find the strength to stand. The wind howled around her like all the demons of hell, and the cold seeped into her bones. She thought of her mother's locket, now lost somewhere in the snow. She thought of Marcus and hoped he never learned what became of her. Most of all, she thought how unfair it was to come so far only to end like this, alone and frozen in a land that didn't even know her name. Through the white chaos, a shape appeared. Eleanor thought it was death coming for her at last, but then strong hands gripped her arms and lifted her. A man's face appeared inches from hers, dark eyes intense with urgency. He shouted something she couldn't hear over the storm, then wrapped her in heavy furs and lifted her as easily as if she weighed nothing. She tried to speak, to ask about the Johnsons, but her frozen lips wouldn't form words. The man carried her through the blizzard with sure steps, as if he could see through the wall of white. Eleanor's consciousness began to slip. Her last coherent thought was surprised that death wore buckskin and had such kind eyes. Eleanor woke to warmth and the smell of wood smoke. Her body ached everywhere, but particularly her feet and hands, which burned. A sensation returned to them. She was lying on soft furs in a space that took her confused mind several moments to identify. The circular wall, the central fire pit, the hide stretched over a wooden frame. A teepee. She was in an Indian teepee. Fear cut through her disorientation. Every story she'd heard about savages and massacres flooded her mind. She tried to sit up, but her body refused to cooperate. A woman appeared in her line of sight, older with graying hair braided down her back. She spoke in a language Eleanor didn't recognize, her tone gentle and soothing. She held a cup to Eleanor's lips, and the warm liquid inside tasted of herbs and something slightly sweet. Eleanor drank because she was too weak to resist. The woman smiled and patted her arm, then said something else in that flowing, unfamiliar language. Eleanor's fear began to ease slightly. Whatever this place was, whoever these people were, they had saved her life and were now tending her injuries. That had to count for something. Over the next 3 days, Eleanor existed in a strange limbo between worlds. The woman, whose name sounded like Wakanyela, cared for her with practiced efficiency. She brought food, changed Eleanor's clothes when fever made her sweat through them, and applied poultices to her frost-damaged fingers and toes. Eleanor would later learn she'd been hours from losing several toes to frostbite. Other women came and went, curious but not unkind, speaking to each other in their lyrical language while examining the white woman who'd appeared in their camp during the blizzard. It was on the 4th day that Eleanor finally met the man who had saved her life. He ducked through the teepee entrance with natural grace, and Eleanor recognized him immediately despite her fever-blurred memories. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with long black hair and features that would have been called handsome in any culture. He wore a mixture of traditional clothing and white man's goods, buckskin leggings with a cloth shirt, his bearing that of someone accustomed to authority. When he spoke, his English was clear and precise, learned from missionaries or traders. His name was Thathienka Inasian, which meant standing bull, though he told her most white people just called him Bull. He was a chief, though not the principal chief of this small band of Lakota who'd chosen to remain on traditional lands rather than move to the reservation. They numbered perhaps 40 people, families mostly, trying to maintain their way of life in an increasingly hostile world. He explained that they'd found her and the Johnson family during the blizzard. The Johnsons were recovering in another teepee. All had survived, though Mr. Johnson had lost 3 fingers to frostbite. Eleanor listened to his explanation with growing amazement. These people, whom white society labeled as savages, had risked the storm to save complete strangers. They'd brought 5 white people into their winter camp and were caring for them with no expectation of reward. The contrast with the so-called civilized society she'd fled was stark and humbling. When she tried to thank Standing Bull, her voice broke. He studied her with those dark, intelligent eyes and asked a question that made her breath catch. He asked why she was running, because he could always recognize someone fleeing something dangerous. Eleanor found herself telling him everything. The words poured out of her in a torrent, months of suppressed fear and pain finally finding voice. She told him about Marcus, about the beatings and the terror, about her desperate escape and her plan to disappear into the Western Territories. She showed him the fading bruises on her arms, the scar on her temple from where Marcus had thrown a lamp at her head. She expected judgment or pity, but Standing Bull's expression remained calm and attentive. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he told her something that changed everything. He said his people understood what it meant to flee from those who claimed to own you. He spoke of treaties broken, of lands stolen, of families torn apart by a government that viewed them as obstacles to progress. He talked about the reservation system, how it was designed to destroy their culture and make them dependent on white charity. His band had chosen freedom over security, accepting the hardships of traditional life rather than submit to control. They were refugees in their own land, much as Eleanor was now a refugee from her own culture. The parallel was both heartbreaking and oddly comforting. Standing Bull made her an offer. She could stay with them through the winter if she wished. When spring came, they would help her reach Oregon or California, wherever she wanted to go. In return, she would teach the children English, giving them tools to navigate the white world that was rapidly consuming their own. It was a practical exchange, but the way he presented it made Eleanor feel like an equal rather than a charity case. She accepted without hesitation. The Lakota camp, this circle of teepees on the winter prairie, felt safer than anywhere she'd been since leaving England. Here, at least, no one would think to search for Marcus Thornton's missing wife. Winter on the Great Plains tested Eleanor in ways she never imagined. The cold was relentless, the wind never ceased, and the work required to survive was constant and backbreaking. Yet she found herself happier than she'd been in years. The Lakota camp operated on principles of cooperation and mutual support that fascinated her. Everyone contributed according to their abilities. Children were raised communally, elders were respected and cared for, and decisions affecting the band were discussed openly. It was nothing like the rigid hierarchies and isolated families of white society. Eleanor taught English to a group of children every afternoon in Wakinyela's teepee. Her students ranged from 5 to 15, all eager to learn despite the difficult sounds and strange grammar. In return, they taught her Lakota words and customs. She learned to properly tan a hide, to make pemmican, to move through snow without leaving obvious tracks. The women accepted her with varying degrees of warmth, but none showed the catty cruelty she'd encountered among Philadelphia's society ladies. Here, survival mattered more than gossip. Standing Bull visited her lessons often, ostensibly to check on the children's progress. Eleanor noticed he always seemed to find reasons to linger, helping translate difficult concepts or sharing stories that illustrated her teaching points. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was reading too much into simple kindness. But her heart betrayed her logic, beating faster whenever he appeared. She caught herself watching for him during the day, listening for his voice among the camp's constant sounds. It was dangerous to feel this way, to let herself hope for something she had no right to want. The Johnsons left when the spring thaw began, heading for their homestead with gifts of food and warm wishes from the Lakota band. Eleanor helped Mrs. Johnson pack and accepted her tearful gratitude. The woman pressed a small Bible into Eleanor's hands and whispered that she would pray for her. Eleanor didn't have the heart to say she'd lost faith in white man's God somewhere between Philadelphia and the frozen prairie. If there was divinity in the world, she felt it more in the Lakota's reverence for the earth and sky than in any church she'd known. One evening in late April, Standing Bull asked Eleanor to walk with him along the creek that ran near the camp. The air was finally warm, carrying the scent of new grass and wildflowers. They walked in comfortable silence for a while before he spoke. He told her that his first wife had died 3 years earlier in childbirth, taking their son with her. He hadn't intended to marry again, but something about Eleanor had touched his heart from that first moment in the blizzard. He saw her strength, her intelligence, and her capacity for survival. He asked if she could ever consider staying permanently, not as a teacher or guest, but as his wife. Eleanor's first instinct was panic. She'd sworn never to belong to any man again, never to give someone that kind of power over her life. But Standing Bull wasn't Marcus. He wasn't asking to own her or control her. He was offering partnership, the kind she'd seen in Lakota marriages where men and women worked as equals. She tried to explain her fear, stammering through her concerns about their different worlds, the danger Marcus still represented, the impossibility of their situation. Standing Bull listened patiently, then took her hand. He said that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Eleanor thought about her journey from that dark house in Philadelphia to this creek bank under the spring sky. She'd crossed an ocean, escaped a monster, survived a blizzard, and learned to live in a culture completely foreign to everything she'd known. She'd already done impossible things. Perhaps one more wasn't too much to ask. She looked into Standing Bull's eyes and saw not ownership but invitation, not control but respect. She said yes, her voice steady, and felt something break free inside her chest. The fear that had lived there for so long finally began to dissolve. Their marriage ceremony blended Lakota tradition with Eleanor's own heritage. Standing Bull gave gifts to the community, demonstrating his ability to provide for a wife. Eleanor wore a dress made of soft deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork, created by the women of the camp. They exchanged promises in both English and Lakota, speaking their commitment to care for each other in all circumstances. There was no priest to declare them married, no legal document to bind them. Just their word, witnessed by the sky and earth and the people who had become Eleanor's new family. Eleanor Hayes Thornton became Eleanor Standing Bull, though she rarely used any name at all among the Lakota, who identified people by actions rather than formal titles. She learned to move a camp efficiently, to read weather signs in the clouds, to heal common ailments with prairie plants. She taught reading and writing to anyone interested, creating a small library of books acquired through careful trade. She bore Standing Bull 2 daughters who grew up speaking both English and Lakota, comfortable in both worlds yet fully belonging to neither. Years later, long after Marcus Thornton had died alone in his fine Philadelphia house, Eleanor would stand on a hill overlooking the camp and marvel at the journey that had brought her there. She'd fled one kind of life only to find another she never could have imagined. The Lakota way was far from perfect, increasingly threatened by the advancing tide of white settlement. But here, she'd found something Marcus could never have given her: respect, partnership, and the freedom to be herself. Standing Bull approached from behind and wrapped his arms around her waist. She leaned into his warmth and felt completely at home. She'd run from a brutal marriage only to find true love where she least expected it. Sometimes, Eleanor thought, you had to lose everything to discover what truly mattered. Her mother's locket, eventually recovered from the snow, hung around her neck as a reminder of where she'd come from. But her heart belonged entirely to where she was now.